There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a ranch at dawn, before the cattle stir and before the wind picks up through the cottonwoods. I had known that silence my whole life. My grandfather built our house at the end of Cutter's Line Road in 1961, back when the land out here was cheap and nobody in their right mind wanted to live 40 minutes from a nearest grocery store. He ran cattle. My father ran cattle. And when he passed, I came home from the city to run cattle too, because some things you don't inherit so much as you return to. Cutter's Line Road was a dirt and gravel track that ran 2.5 miles from the county highway to our gate. It crossed a corner of what used to be open range, then cut through a stretch of land that got sold off in the 90s to a developer who built a subdivision of 140 homes and called it Whisper Creek Estates. The developer platted the subdivision with its own internal streets, all paved, all maintained by the new Homeowners Association. Cutter's Line Road was never one of those streets. It was older than the subdivision by 3 decades. It existed before Whisper Creek's first foundation was poured, and it existed because it had to. It was the only way in or out of 3 ranch properties, mine included. For 20 years, nobody thought twice about it. The road ran along the edge of the development, cattle trucks rumbled past twice a year, and the residents of Whisper Creek waved at me from their porches like neighbors do. Kids from the subdivision used to ride their bikes down to the creek crossing on summer afternoons, and every October I'd leave a few pumpkins from our patch by the mailbox stand at the entrance, just a small gesture between neighbors who happened to share a stretch of gravel. I want to say that clearly at the start, because what happened later makes it sound like there was always tension. There wasn't. Not until the new HOA board took over. My grandfather used to say that a good neighbor is someone who never makes you think about property lines, and for most of my life, that description fit Whisper Creek just fine. The subdivision had its own paved streets, its own clubhouse and pool, its own set of rules about mailbox colors and fence heights that had nothing to do with us. Cutter's Line Road sat outside all of that, a quiet exception nobody questioned, because there was nothing to question. It had simply always been there, doing exactly what it had always done. That happened 2 years ago, when a management company out of the city bought into the community and started professionalizing things, as they like to say at their meetings. New landscaping rules, new parking restrictions, new signage, and then, in the spring, a new gate. I remember the morning I found it. I was hauling a trailer of feed out to the north pasture, same route I'd driven 1,000 times, and there it was, a steel frame gate, freshly painted, bolted into new concrete posts, stretched clean across Cutter's Line Road about a half-mile past the highway turnoff. A keypad sat mounted on a post beside it, blinking a little red light like it was daring me to guess the code. I sat in my truck for a long moment, staring at it, half convinced I'd taken a wrong turn. I hadn't. This was my road. This was the only road. I got out, walked up to the gate, and found a laminated notice zip tied to the bars. It read, in the crisp, corporate font of a property management company, "This roadway is private property of Whisper Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Access is restricted to residents and authorized guests. For gate code requests, contact the HOA office." I stood there reading it twice, because the first read didn't make sense and I wanted to give it a fair second chance to. It still didn't make sense. My family had used that road since before Whisper Creek existed. There was no way, none, that the HOA owned it. But there it was. A locked gate, blocking the only route to my ranch. I ran my hand along the fresh weld seams on the frame, still sharp enough to catch on my glove, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so new could so casually erase something so old. The concrete around the posts hadn't even fully cured. Whoever had done this had moved fast, and moved with confidence, the kind of confidence that usually comes from believing you're standing on solid legal ground. I tried the keypad anyway, punching in a few obvious guesses out of sheer frustration, more habit than hope. Nothing. I sat back down in my truck, and for a moment I just watched a pair of hawks circling over the pasture beyond the gate, on the other side of a barrier that had no business existing at all. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for the rest of this story. I wasn't just angry. I was disoriented. When something that has always simply been true, the road is the road, it's always been open, suddenly isn't true anymore, it rattles something deeper than frustration. For a few minutes I actually doubted myself. I wondered if I'd missed a notice, a mailer, some legal filing that explained all this. I hadn't. Nobody had told me anything. I called the number on the sign. A pleasant, practiced voice informed me that Whisper Creek Estates had recently completed a community security enhancement project, and that non-resident access would now require registration and a nominal monthly access fee. When I explained that I wasn't a resident of Whisper Creek at all, that I was a rancher whose only access to my own property ran through that exact stretch of road, the voice on the phone grew less pleasant. She said she'd have to check with the board. She never called back. I drove around the gate that day, cutting across a rough patch of scrub on the shoulder that nearly took out my trailer axle. I made it home furious, and I stayed furious through dinner, through the night, and into the next morning, when I decided that anger wasn't going to fix anything. Paper would. So I went looking for paper. My grandfather, bless his meticulous heart, had kept every document related to this ranch in a fireproof filing cabinet in the den, organized by year, going back to the original purchase. I spent that whole day at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a stack of yellowed folders, and what I found there was the first real thread I could pull. The original deed to our ranch, dated 1961, described access via what was then called the County Line Cattle Trail, later renamed Cutter's Line Road on county plat maps in the 70s. The deed didn't just mention the road in passing, it explicitly reserved an easement across the neighboring parcels for ingress, egress, and the driving of livestock, recorded in the county register at the courthouse. That easement predated Whisper Creek Estates by over 30 years. Whoever developed that subdivision would have taken title to their land subject to that existing easement. It should have been baked into every single deed the developer sold, disclosed in every title report, noted on every plat. That was promising, but I wasn't a lawyer, and I knew better than to walk into a fight armed with only my own reading of an old document. So the next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. The county recorder's office is not a glamorous place. It's fluorescent lit, it smells like old paper and toner, and the woman behind the counter, whose name tag said Doris, had clearly seen every flavor of property dispute the county had to offer. When I explained what I was looking for, she didn't blink. She just said, "Easement disputes. Always the gates. Come on back." We spent 2 hours together. Doris pulled the original 1961 deed, the recorded easement, and then, this was the important part, the full title chain for the parcel Whisper Creek Estates was built on. She walked me through how to read a plat map, how to trace a legal description, and how to find the recorded subdivision plat itself, filed back in 1994. Here's what we found, and here's where the subdivision plat for Whisper Creek Estates showed the boundary of the development running right up to Cutter's Line Road, but not across it. The developer's own surveyor, back in 1994, had drawn the road as a boundary line, not as an internal asset of the subdivision. It appeared on the plat labeled simply as existing road, not a part of this subdivision. In other words, the very documents the HOA's own predecessor had filed with the county explicitly excluded the road from what they owned. Even more damning, when Doris pulled the deed under which the HOA claimed authority over common areas, the legal description of those common areas, the clubhouse, the retention pond, the internal streets, never once mentioned Cutter's Line Road. Not by name, not by legal description, not by any reference at all. The HOA had no deed to that road. Not a partial interest. Not an easement. Nothing. I sat back in my chair in that little courthouse annex and just breathed for a second. 2 years of steadily rising tension, a locked gate, a monthly access fee, all of it built on a road the HOA had never owned in the first place. Doris made photocopies of everything, then pulled one more document almost as an afterthought, the original 1994 title report the developer's own title company had prepared before the subdivision was ever built. Buried on page 4, under a section labeled Exceptions to Title, was a single line noting the existence of a recorded easement across the northern boundary for agricultural ingress and egress, per instrument recorded 1961. The developer had known. Whoever built Whisper Creek Estates 30 years earlier had been told, in plain language, that this road wasn't theirs to claim. Somewhere between that title report and the new HOA board's decision to install a gate, that knowledge had simply gotten lost, buried under decades of turnover, changing management companies, and nobody bothering to read the file. So how, I asked Doris, does an HOA end up installing a gate across a road they don't have any legal claim to? She gave me a tired, knowing smile. Happens more than you'd think. Somebody on a board sees a road, assumes it belongs to the association because it's near the community, and nobody checks the actual paper before they start pouring concrete. Or somebody knows exactly what they're doing and hopes nobody bothers to look. I didn't know yet which one this was, but I intended to find out. I left the courthouse with certified copies of everything, the original 1961 deed, the recorded easement, the 1994 subdivision plat, and the HOA's declaration of covenants. I made 3 sets. One for myself, one for an attorney, and one, eventually, for the HOA board itself. The attorney I found specialized in rural property and easement law, a soft-spoken but sharp woman named Renata Voss who had handled exactly this kind of dispute more times than she could count. She read through my folder in about 15 minutes and then looked up at me with an expression that was somewhere between sympathy and satisfaction. "This is about as clean a case as I've ever seen," she said. "They don't own the road. They don't have an easement interest in the road. And you have a recorded, prior easement that guarantees your access across it. Legally, they had no authority to install a barrier here at all, let alone charge you a fee to use your own access." She explained the next steps plainly. First, a formal letter, a demand that the HOA remove the gate and cease charging access fees, backed by the recorded documents, sent by certified mail so there would be no claim later that they hadn't been informed. Second, if they refused, a petition to the court for an injunction, which is simply a judge's order requiring someone to stop doing something immediately, in this case blocking a lawful easement. Third, if it came to it, a lawsuit to formally quiet title, a legal process that asks a court to settle, once and for all, who actually holds what rights to a piece of land, so that nobody can raise the argument again down the road. The letter went out on a Thursday. I remember because I drove past the gate that same afternoon, and for a strange, almost funny moment, I felt nothing but calm looking at it. It wasn't a wall anymore in my mind. It was a mistake, and mistakes, when you have the paperwork, tend to have a shelf life. 2 weeks passed with no response. Then I got a call, not from the HOA's attorney, but from a board member herself, a woman named Carol Ashby, who introduced herself as the HOA's president. She wanted to talk it through, neighbor to neighbor, before things got more formal. I agreed to meet, mostly because Renata told me it couldn't hurt, as long as I didn't sign anything and didn't agree to any terms on the spot. We met at a coffee shop in town. Carol was polite, a little nervous, and clearly under the impression that the road had come with the community when she and her husband bought their house 8 years earlier. She told me the gate had actually been the previous board's idea, pushed through under a prior HOA president who had since moved away, someone who had told the rest of the board, with total confidence, that the road was association property, always had been. Nobody, it turned out, had ever pulled the actual deed. Not the board. Not the property management company. Not even the contractor who poured the concrete posts. Everyone had simply assumed, because the road ran along the edge of their community and had always been unmarked and unpaved, that it must belong to somebody official, and the somebody official must be them. I laid the documents out on the table between us, the 1994 plat with its plain language excluding the road, the 1961 easement, the declaration of covenants with its silence on the subject. Carol read through them slowly, and I watched her expression shift from polite skepticism to something quieter and more uncomfortable. To her credit, she didn't argue. She just said, "I need to bring this to the full board." The full board meeting happened 3 weeks later, and Renata came with me. It was held in the clubhouse, in a room with stackable chairs and a whiteboard still smudged with notes about pool hours. About a dozen residents showed up too, curious about the gate that had generated more neighborhood gossip than anything since the retention pond flooded 2 summers back. The property management representative, a man who introduced himself only by his company title, tried at first to argue that the gate had been installed for community security and that access fees were standard practice for shared infrastructure. Renata, without raising her voice even slightly, asked him to point to the specific document that established Whisper Creek's ownership or easement interest in Cutter's Line Road. He couldn't. Nobody could. Because it didn't exist. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no shouting, no gavel banging, none of the theatrical confrontation you sometimes hear about in stories like this. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more uncomfortable, because it was the sound of a room full of reasonable people slowly realizing that a decision they'd all gone along with, or simply never questioned, had been built on nothing at all. I watched faces change around that room as Renata walked through the timeline out loud. The 1961 easement, the 1994 plat, the title report the developer had filed and then apparently forgotten. A man in the second row, who I later learned had actually voted in favor of the gate the year before, kept shaking his head slowly, not in disagreement but in something closer to disbelief at how far a simple assumption had been allowed to travel. Nobody in that room was a villain. That was the strange part. They were homeowners who had trusted a process, trusted a board, trusted a management company that was supposed to have already done the homework nobody had actually done. The property manager tried once more, a little weaker this time, to suggest that even without a recorded ownership interest, the HOA might have some claim through what he called long-standing community use. Renata calmly explained that the opposite was true, that decades of the road being used freely by ranch families, without objection or restriction from anyone, was itself evidence against any claim of exclusive HOA control, not for it. If anything, she said, the historical record supported exactly the opposite conclusion from the one he was reaching for. One resident asked how much the community had spent on the gate installation. Someone else asked how much had been collected in access fees from the other two ranch families who shared the road, fees that, it turned out, had been quietly charged for over a year before I'd even encountered the gate myself. The number, when the treasurer read it aloud, made several people in the room visibly wince. Carol, to her credit, moved for an immediate vote to remove the gate and refund the collected fees, pending legal review. It passed unanimously. Even the board members who had approved the gate in the first place voted for it, which told me something about how little appetite there was, once the truth was on the table, to keep defending a mistake. The gate came down on a Tuesday morning, about 6 weeks after I first found it blocking my road. I wasn't there for the removal. I was out checking fence line on the far side of the property, but my neighbor, one of the other two ranch families who shared Cutter's Line Road, sent me a photo. Just an empty stretch of gravel road, the concrete posts already pulled, dust still settling where the equipment had been. I'll admit I sat in my truck for a minute looking at that photo, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was less like triumph and more like relief. Two ranch families before me had been quietly paying that access fee for over a year, assuming, as most people do, that an official-looking notice from an HOA carried some kind of legal weight. It doesn't, not automatically. It only carries weight if the paper behind it actually says what it claims to say. The HOA's attorney, once retained properly, reviewed everything and confirmed in writing what Renata had already told me, that the association had no recorded interest in Cutter's Line Road, that the gate had been an unauthorized encroachment on a lawful easement, and that the access fees collected from the ranch families should be refunded in full. To their credit, the board did exactly that, and included a formal written acknowledgement, recorded with the county, that Cutter's Line Road was not now nor had ever been part of the Whisper Creek Estate's common areas. That document now sits in my own filing cabinet, right behind my grandfather's original 1961 deed, in case anyone ever tries this again. A few weeks after the gate came down, Carol called me again, this time not about legal matters but just to talk. She told me the board had adopted a new policy, almost embarrassingly obvious in hindsight, requiring any future claim of ownership or authority over a piece of land to be verified against an actual recorded deed before any action was taken, gates included. She laughed a little when she said it, the kind of laugh that comes from realizing something should have been common sense all along. I told her I appreciated the call, and I meant it. Not every HOA story ends with the people involved acting in good faith once the truth comes out, but hers did, and that mattered to me more than I expected it to. The two other ranch families who shared the road stopped by not long after, one bringing a case of preserves his wife had put up that summer, the other just shaking my hand on the porch and saying thank you for doing the digging. None of them had known where to start. I told them the truth, which is that I hadn't done anything particularly clever. I had simply gotten angry enough to open a filing cabinet, and patient enough to sit in a courthouse for an afternoon with a woman named Doris who knew exactly where to look. I think about this whole episode now not with anger, but with a kind of grim gratitude, because it taught me something that I think applies well beyond ranch roads and property lines. Institutions, HOAs, management companies, even well-meaning neighbors, can develop a kind of quiet confidence about their own authority that has nothing to do with whether that authority actually exists on paper. A gate looks official. A laminated notice looks official. A keypad and a fresh coat of paint look official. None of that is the same as a deed. What actually settled this dispute wasn't outrage, and it wasn't confrontation. It was patience, and paperwork, and a woman named Doris at the county recorder's office who knew exactly which drawer to pull open. The truth had been sitting in that courthouse the entire time, recorded in black and white since before most of Whisper Creek's residents were even born, waiting for somebody to simply go and look. These days, Cutter's Line Road is quiet again, the way it was for those first 20 years, before anyone thought to put a gate across it. My grandfather's easement still runs where it always ran, unbothered, exactly as it was written in 1961. And every time I drive that stretch of gravel now, past the spot where the concrete posts used to be, I feel less like I won something and more like something that was always true simply got to stay true. If there's a lesson in all of this, I think it's a simple one. Ownership isn't a feeling, and it isn't a gate, and it isn't even confidence. It's a record, filed somewhere quiet, waiting for anyone patient enough to go find it. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do in the face of an unjust barrier isn't to push against it directly. It's to go find the paper that proves it was never supposed to be there at all. That's the whole story. A road my family used for over 60 years, a gate that went up without anyone checking the deed, and a courthouse file that quietly proved the truth all along. If you've ever dealt with an HOA overstepping its bounds, or a boundary dispute of your own, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that the truth is usually just sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting to be found.